From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So as I said before, happy to have Connor as a part of our program here today. Connor, I really thought, because by now, listen, people know the story for Georgia and Alabama. They're kind of ready for the game against Auburn, the chance to turn the page, and how Georgia goes about that's important. And your story looking at how kind of Georgia has used its freshmen, how Alabama has used its freshmen. Stark contrast that I think means more than just maybe what helped decide this game this past Saturday. Thought you did a good job of asking Kirby about that directly yesterday. Seems like it's a topic that Kirby doesn't necessarily want to reveal a lot of details about. But I do think it's important when you see, what Alabama's doing with its secondary. Certainly Ryan Williams. I don't know if you heard this or not. Ryan Williams is only 17 years old. I don't know if you heard that or not. That's shocking news. But, Georgia sometimes seems like, Nate Frazier may be the best example of this, a little more cautious with some of its freshmen. So I want people to read the story, so don't give the whole thing away here. But just give me your premise here of what you've noticed from Georgia and Alabama in terms of how it's used its freshmen and maybe what that means for Georgia against Auburn on Saturday and moving forward for the rest of the season.
Yeah, so I think this starts when I'm looking at the snap counts on Sunday, and KJ Bolden's the only freshman from Georgia that played, and he played 41 snaps. And then you're going back and you're watching that game, and you see 17-year-old Ryan Williams making that play late in that game, finishing with 6 catches and 177 yards. But he wasn't the only freshman to make an impact. In fact, Zabian Brown, a freshman cornerback, had the game-sealing interception in that game. And so you go back, you count up the snap counts for Alabama. KJ Bolden played 41 snaps. He was the only freshman to do so for Georgia on Saturday. Alabama had 176 snaps from 5 freshmen in that game. And so in counting through it and going through it, Georgia had the number 1 recruiting class in the country last year. Alabama had the number 2 recruiting class in the country last year. And when we're in an age now in college football, especially at these programs like Georgia, like Alabama, that want to sign so many players out of high school and not rely on the transfer portal. But yet those schools are still losing a ton to the transfer portal every year. Georgia and Alabama both lost over 20 players. You have to, I think, find a way to get more out of your freshman class early on. And so and again, it's understandable. This is the first time that a lot of these guys are having to play winning football. And I'm not saying that you should play these guys over veterans who are obviously better. But I do think that in this day and age of college football, where rosters skew younger and younger, a team's ability to get meaningful contributions right away out of true freshmen is going to be something that I think is more important going forward. And right now, Georgia is not doing that on the same level as Alabama. And the fact that Alabama, whether because they had to out of need or because they just brought in a better group that is able to contribute immediately, I think the difference in what Alabama got out of its freshmen compared to what Georgia got out of its was something that made a difference on Saturday.
So I think this is such an important topic. I'm really glad you're writing about it. And there are like 2 thoughts that sort of, I guess, stand out for me about this. The first thing is, I think the notion of who's a 4-star and who's a 5-star, I think that becomes sort of an antiquated way to describe recruits based on what you just said. When the real delineation here is who's capable of playing right away and who isn't. And what makes someone capable of playing right away may be a number of things, the position they play, the talent they have, whatever else. But a sort of high 4-star player who's kind of treated as a developmental project, well, Kirby Smart has acknowledged they only plan on keeping about 70% of the players they sign out of high school. They know about, more than a third are going to leave the Georgia program. So therefore, if you bring in a high 4-star player, in some cases even a 5-star player, but he's sort of a developmental guy who's kind of only playing special teams for you and hoping for a chance to play in year 2. Who's to say as a fan, I ever get a chance to actually see that guy on the field? He really almost doesn't matter. So this idea of, well, so-and-so the 3-star and so-so is a 4-star and so-so is a 5-star. Ultimately now it's sort of a binary thing of, can you play right away or can you not? And if you can't play right away, then who cares how good you were in high school?
Right. And I'm not saying every player needs to be like Carson Beck and wait their turn to come see the field at Georgia. You still do need guys in your program that are willing to be patient there. But I was struck last week. I was reading a story by John Talty of CBS Sports talking about some of the issues at Auburn. And Auburn signed a 4-star prospect in last year's class, Walker Wright, who finished, I think, as a top 50 overall prospect in the class at quarterback. But Talty, in the same breath, mentions that he's a year or two away from possibly contributing at Auburn. And to your point, that's a problem in how I think recruiting rankings are done nowadays, especially in this day and age in which college football in which we're playing, because so many of these guys are going to abdicate the program before they even get a chance to really be there. You know, you saw, I think, 4 guys from the 2023 freshman class leave after a year. And so I think going forward, if you're Georgia, again, you preach development. And Kirby Smart was right, I think, to bring up guys like Jordan Davis, guys like Quay Walker, Ladd McConkey, who weren't contributors freshman year, who ultimately developed into difference-making players. You need that. But you also need guys that I think are going to come in and play a role for you going forward. And so there are sort of 3 different types of buckets right now, I think, when I look at recruits and how they fit. And the first one is those guys like a Quay Walker, Ladd McConkey, Eric Stokes, those guys that redshirt and just need a year to get in there and go play. Then there is the obvious, these guys are able to play from day one. Malachi Starks, Michael Williams, KJ Bolden is this year's avatar for that group. And right now, Georgia is trying to find guys that I think fit into a very important third bucket. These are guys that, maybe not ready to start the season, but over the course of the year, they begin taking more snaps, getting more roles, and playing a bigger part in this team. You think Jordan Davis, you think Trayvon Walker, Jalen Walker in years past as well, Lewis Seen. Those are the types of guys that Georgia is looking for right now. Can Nate Frazier do that? We'll see. Joseph Jonah-Ajonye, a name to mention there. Ellis Robinson, someone I'm very interested in seeing how his development continues this fall. And so those are the types of guys where I think Georgia needs to prioritize, not with this team, but moving forward with recruits. Okay, yes, you need obviously the super mega stars and guys that can play right away, but you're also probably going to need some guys that are at least physically and mentally able of playing and helping for you at some point during the season, because rosters are skewing younger, and with seasons being longer, those guys just take on a naturally more important part in the depth of this team.
Okay, let me say one more thing about this, and I don't think this is going to be very popular, but I don't think we can stop this topic without me saying this. The other thing about all of this is, for Kirby to essentially get up yesterday and say that Nate Frazier didn't play, essentially a DNP CD, did not play coach's decision, I don't know that's enough transparency anymore in the modern age in which we're living. And this is not like Kirby versus the media. Frankly, I've never cared about any of that kind of stuff. To me, this is one of those things where, I mean, I was told, I don't know if this is true, but I was told that, like, Nick Saban mentioned Nate Frazier on game day on Saturday. Like, this is a freshman of enough prominence that Saban's talking about him on game day. And, one of the top backs in the country for the most recent class, I'm presuming it took NIL money to get him to Georgia. That's NIL money that came out of the pocket of a Georgia booster somehow, some way. And in the future, with, like, revenue sharing, things like that, ticket prices are going up. The money that Georgia extracts from fans and boosters, they're giving directly to the players. And if you give that money to a freshman to bring him to Georgia, but then essentially decide, well, he's not good enough yet to play in this game, then I think a very fair question to ask in this very contemporary age in which we live is, well, should you be using that money on something else? You can't afford to have dead money in the salary cap in the NFL. And I think there's a version of kind of dead money in college football, that if you're spending a lot of this money on players who you bring in and decide you don't want to play them, that's money that could have been allocated somewhere else. And I know that seems like kind of gross, based on what college football used to be, but it ain't that way anymore. And so if you bring in freshmen, and I presume you have to play the same kind of full combat, sport everybody else does to bring these players in, if you bring them in and then decide, well, they're not quite ready yet, then did you really allocate your resources as best as you possibly could? I know that sounds kind of gross, but it just sort of seems like those are the conversations we ought to be having.
Yeah, it's not like Georgia's playing Scrabble to get these guys. And I'll go one step further. If you're spending resources to bring in a guy like Nate Frazier and he's not playing, well, those resources could have gone elsewhere to help you. And you see with what Auburn does with Cam Coleman this weekend. You saw what Alabama did with the 17-year-old Ryan Williams last weekend. I think when you look at that and you see that, you do open yourself up to some questions when it comes to playing with freshmen and going after those freshman players there. So I think, again, it's all opportunity costs. As you point out, this is modern economics in terms of a salary cap and the management of that. And in terms of transparency, look, with Nate Frazier in particular, we all saw him play and make a difference in that game against Clemson. But since then, his impact has waned with each week. And part of, Saturday, and while I'm not necessarily so scandalized with this past Saturday, is
Yeah.
because just score was so lopsided right
Yep.
away because it was 28-0, 4 possessions into the game. And naturally, it's going to take away from the running back. You also have Trevor Etienne, who I do think has been a good player on this team. But Georgia, I think moving forward, Nate Frazier represents a guy who I think they do have to find a way to get more out of and find ways to use him as an impactful playmaker. Because Nate Frazier, well, again, they didn't have a great receiver in this class. Skill player is one area where Alabama has always, I think, consistently had an edge over Georgia. And so you got to show, I think, when it comes to positions like running back, when it comes to positions like wide receiver, tight end, you can throw in there as well with the history that Georgia has had there, that those have to be places where, because we know that those guys are just naturally more expensive coming out of high school, you've got to show that you can win those recruiting battles and then go and play them so that they can make that impact right away. So, as gross as this sounds, you're making a return on that investment.
Yeah.